Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Today we will be focused on the Japanese biopharma perspective. We have an amazing panel who will we will challenge each other as well as give you guys all the great perspectives on all of our experiences across the industry and all of the different aspects of how we've interacted and really been informed, and especially in the Japanese organization. So I'm going to turn it over to Anka to get us started.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much. I'm going to moderate this session. I'm going to start with the introductions. First with me, Anca Cupescu, CEO and founder of Strategicon. I worked with a number of Japanese companies and hope to work with many more. And thrilled to introduce our host, Brenda Medina. Brenda, on to you first.
Sure. I'm Brenda Medina. I am currently at Kiowa Caring. Previously also was at AZI. My current role is a global head of clinical business operations, which includes all things clinical around business and systems. I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
Hello, my name is Jen Trevor, and I'm the Global Category Lead for Clinical Outsourcing at Astellas Pharma. I've been there for the greater part of a decade and in and out of different biotech as well as contract manufacturer, even a stint in the government background.
Thank you, Jen. On to you, Ratan.
Maybe
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Ratan Ratnes. I'm head of procurement at Taiho Oncology. I have been at Taiho since 2021. Taiho is part of Otsuka, and I have been at Otsuka since 2012. So, going on my 13th year at a Japanese company. So, Brian?
Nice to see everybody today. Brian Slisky, I'm a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I work in our R&D practice. Just some background on me. Started my career at Allergan, spent some time at Parexel as a monitor, and then finally Forest Labs in Jersey City. I focus on R&D operations, so everything from sourcing strategy through oversight, as you can imagine. Have done a lot of work with Japanese companies, some of whom are on the phone, others who are not, but spent a lot of time in Japan as part of that work, and working through some of the, I would say, global issues related to kind of global development organizations and making sure that we are developing fit for purpose operating models that work amongst those different global operating cultures. So looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. And we had the sixth panelist, Cassandra Murphy from Shionogi. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today, but I know she will be seeing the recording and sending us her very best. So let's get started. We organize this webinar into two parts. The first part is more about observations. I recognize that there is no Japanese colleague in this group. Instead, you have an all-American group in here of clinical business operations experts that have worked with Japanese companies. And this is an interesting journey from many perspectives because there are nuances that we will discuss in the first part of the conversation that are relevant not only to your colleagues in Japan, your colleagues in the US or in Europe that may work with other Japanese companies in similar roles, and also from anyone who may be considering joining a clinical business operation in a Japanese pharma. Then we'll do a very quick poll to assess a bit the temperature of the audience. And then we will move into success stories. We are not going to do the poll just yet. If we could take it away from the screen, we are actually going to start with the observations. Karen, is it possible to take the poll from the screen?
No, I can't take it off now. Otherwise, we're just going to end it. So.
Okay, well then, in this case, let's start with the poll. Not exactly as planned. Okay, that's fine. So I'm going to read it out loud. And the question is, Yes, what are the approaches that work best in implementing new e-clinical technologies in Japanese and Asian Pacific companies? And we have 23% of people voting, options being strong partnership with technology provider, communication, listening to all your stakeholders, clearly define the future, the present and future vision, create a cross-cultural technology, and starting slow. Okay, let's see a few more votes, please, guys, in the audience. Give us your vibe and get us started here on a great discussion. I know Brenda is smiling, and I know exactly why. Everybody is smiling here. You go, 54%. Just give us one more. Let's get to 75%. Come on, guys. Okay, almost. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, should we stop now? 77% of you voted. Thank you so much. So, panelists, taking a look at this, are you surprised?
No. I think for me, it's very aligned to some of the topics that we've discussed. So I think I definitely concur with some of the responses.
So number one, strong partnership with technology provider. Second, clearly defined current state and future vision. Any thoughts from you, Ratan, Brian?
Um, to me, I think, they hit the, the pole went to the right stuff. If you think about it, if we are implementing a solution, first things comes out to the technology. And second, unless until you know where you are going, how will you get there? So I think, audience picked these two right as the top two choices.
Yeah, I maybe just add, I would be surprised that clearly defined current state and future vision did not bubble up to the top. The reason I share that is there's quite a bit of discourse in the industry about goals and objectives and what we're looking to achieve. Sometimes when I do strategy projects ahead of implementation, you find out that within organizations, there's a myriad of different opinions about what we're looking to achieve. Part of that is because there's different functions. Part of that is because there isn't alignment. I would use risk-based monitoring as like one acute use case where you've seen a lot of different, when you go and speak to leaders and you say, hey, what's your goal with risk-based monitoring? Some people say compliance. We want to be in line with industry. Others say our goal is cost savings. Others say compliance and data quality. So without optimizing for that singular or multifactorial vision and strategy, it's really difficult to really execute and get the business value that you're looking to achieve. So I would argue, by no means, I think Anka is this something that is a forcing function to say this is number one. I think all of these are highly relevant, but typically current state and future state vision, in order to get organizational alignment, is the tip of the spear for us.
Okay. You come from a big consulting company, so we got to get the requirements, the gap analysis at the very top of the journey, at least by the book. Jen, any thoughts on the poll? And we'll take it down and go to the discussion.
Yeah, no, I absolutely concur with my colleagues, and certainly the piece that we'll have time to discuss today is around alignment and how that's different, and probably our experiences in working for non-Western pharma companies as success with any project need to make sure that you have buy-in so that there's no blockers, and in fact, we're looking for an organizational enablement, whether it's the tech team that's going to be facilitating part of this, or if it's a stakeholder that wants to make sure that they have access for all the stakeholders, and even the enterprise view. That's generally a piece that can be an obstacle of if you're wanting to implement some new e-clinical solution, is how does that fit into your enterprise solution for other technologies?
Thank you for this. And my thoughts here very much aligned as well. I actually found that the clear definition of the current state and future vision is lacking in most implementations of Clinical Maestro, for that matter. but I've seen it across the board as companies wanting to do the baby steps first and then do the analysis. And I'm surprised baby steps, it was only 10%. It's a desire to try out a solution and then think about what that solution would mean. Obviously would be much better to start with a vision and then do the baby steps in implementing the solution. I found that whenever we were super successful, it's when the partnership was strong. So it's when there was a vision and a desire to do something together. So definitely um, concurring with the poll, but a bit surprised that the baby steps came at the bottom. Maybe because it was the last question. Um, so let's take the poll away if possible. So, okay, wonderful. And let's start with the observations. I know we all had very unique experience working with Japanese companies, and we all that experience are very personal. So I want to start with you, Brenda, as the host on your observations. And I know in the prep discussion, we discussed a lot about return on investment. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen in your long professional journey, actually, with different Japanese companies and your current role.
Yes, thank you, Anka. So, for me, the initial observation that we had in the poll ties very well into this. There's always a very clear kind of conceptual vision of where the organization wants to go in both organizations that I've been in of Japanese background, and that's always very clear. And there's this big kind of gap that takes you down to the detail. And in the Japanese companies that I've been, we're very focused on action plans, detail oriented, execution, and making sure that we tie that. What I think sometimes gets lost is that return on investment and the proof of that. So when you do that exercise pretty well, especially in the organizations that I've been in, where we've been able to show that return on investment and prove it out every time, from all the way from the top senior management all the way to the individuals that touch and breathe and really manage those tools. It is a much more effective buy-in, not just the first time, but all the other times I then you take it forward. So the vision is there, the execution and action plan is there, but the ROI sometimes tends to be very soft and not well used. And for me, what's been a real success is to really use that return on investment to really show that the actions and then the planning that we are really good at sometimes does take a little bit longer to measure, but it is proof that if you well thought out vision ties to the action plan, then you could return that to the organization. So it is important that to marry those two things with data, with making sure that there is hard, solid proof of that investment and how you're going to then have that technology project or any project return that experience to the organization. So for me, that's been a real win in a lot of the challenges that I've received as either a task or a project, is showing that value in return. Sometimes we don't take the time to put those measurements and put those KPIs in place of how that's going to return. But if you do it well, for me, it's been a real success that I recommend everyone to really put at the forefront of their project.
And Brenda, you've seen Japanese companies putting more or less focus on return on investment versus other companies as an observation.
I I think for me, what I do see is that detailed plan of how to execute, a lot of details, a lot of information. But when you really do that analysis up front and say you might not need the detail, but you have that return on investment that proves that out, it's not so much about the detail anymore, but it's about the value. So that has occurred in both organizations that I've been, where you could show the value. You might not need to go to the level of detail that everybody, I joke a lot in my organization now that I'm going to buy a shirt that says simplification, because a lot of the things that I've put in place was really simplifying things and making sure that people are able to really use the information or really apply what they're doing with a lot of the tools or the data that we're providing. So it's a big joke, but it's actually really real. The more simplistic that the things that we had became, the more the audience and the users and management understood the purpose and go back to the vision with the ROI as a proof of that return. So that's been very valuable in my organization for sure, especially now.
That's excellent point. Actually, I would like to go to you, Jen, with that T-shirt that simplification. What would your what what are your observations working with Japanese companies? I think we all recognize simplification is key, but it's very deliberate, right? Um, but going to you, what can you tell us about maybe your experience with decision making process, or even trying to make the point of becoming less complex, or I'm sorry, more complex, less simple, or actually the other way around?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a great perspective and point to think that, you know, when it comes to decision making, I mean, there's a word, namawashi, that my understanding is essentially it's the collective getting an understanding or agreement on a process. And so, you know, when you're going to go into a meeting, you're not going to go into a meeting and make a decision at the time. You'll already have met with all of your stakeholders ahead of time to make sure that you agree on whatever process that you're discussing. And so all of that is a different style of decision making that adds time to a process. So I think that when you're working in, you know, Western versus non-Western um, type of environment, I think you have to take into consideration how how are you going to be able to drive forward any type of technological solution, knowing that you're going to have to get buy-in from multiple stakeholders in various iterations.
That is a great point, and getting the buy-in from multiple stakeholders is no easy undertaking, especially when the expertise may vary and the expectations may vary, and possibly the vision is not fully aligned. I wonder, Ratan, from your perspective, to communicate or gain consensus on that vision, how important is the communication, or how do you get the people to actually come in the meeting and align?
So Japan, like, when I started working in, 12 years ago now, it was a learning experience for me. And, what it was is that you have to first gain the trust that the whole colleague trusts you. Plus, the decision making and the planning horizon is longer in Japan rather than how typical publicly traded company in say US is. Like I can tell you that Otsuka Holding, we still do something called MLTP. So it's a 5-year plan. We release every 5 years, and we will say these would be the top 10 compounds we would be focusing on. These 3 will come into the second tier. So it's a lot more detailed plan. So if you think about when I would lead the projects, there are a lot of alignment needed internally, especially with our Japanese colleagues, before you really go into meeting. And to some extent, it was a learning experience, but once you get hold of it and you buy the trust, then those processes are much faster. So if you are one of the Western-based people like us dealing with Japanese, just keep the faith that initially you might be a little bit frustrated that how long it's taking to make the decision. Yes, that's true because of the alignment needed and things like that. But that process gets easier and easier the more you are trusted in the organization.
Would you say that the language is a barrier in that could add to the timeline? For example, I've had my own experience, but you have been in the space much longer.
I would say yes, to some extent, because if you really think about when we have one of the large meetings, there is always a translator on because some of the colleagues may not speak. So to some extent, if you have a 1 hour call, normally if it's just American call, you can do plan for the whole hour what topic you will discuss, but there you have to think about just the translation timeline, things like that. So probably you would plan for 20-25 minutes. So that's in the larger meeting setting. But if I think about colleagues I work day to day directly in, say, procurement and outsourcing, most of them are pretty good in English. So it's like conversation in English. So it depends, but you have to really think about the audience of the meeting when you are going in, because we have to plan for it. Who is there who won't be speaking English? So you have to kind of okay, how, because we don't know all the leaders. So I have to talk my counterpart, how good is his English? Does he speak English? All those things you have to plan for. So you have to say, okay, I need to get a translator then. So those are the pieces, which you have to think about, but it is what it is, and we make the best of it.
That's right. I mean, none of us speaks Japanese, let's be honest.
Let's
So
be honest with that.
It's fine.
yeah, that would be a
Been
much bigger
trying for 6
undertaking.
months.
That's excellent. What are your observations, Brian, from not having lived in Japan, so working closely with Japanese companies there in kind of in their territory, but also working with Japanese subsidiaries in the US like we have been?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have not lived in Japan, but I have spent maybe
Or
2 to 3 years in and out of Japan quite frequently. So I would say, Jen had mentioned one of the Japanese terms. One that I recall very acutely is Kaizen, and that is kind of perfection of craft, right? Material improvement, continuous improvement. It's worked out very well for auto manufacturers like Toyota.
Mhm, mhm.
I think that it's worked out very well for Japanese pharma companies in terms of approach to process and some of the outcomes. I think one thing that I would also just highlight, though, as a result of some of that is Japanese culture with rotational programs has been challenging with the way that we've deployed more global programs. So the way that Japan companies organize around universities and have a very close recruiting platform within those universities is tried and trusted. It's closely protected and held. Once people get into Japanese companies, they rotate around in a lot of myriad of different functions, which is great and accretive for educational purposes. But it does create somewhat of a gap when it comes to competency within certain functions, where in the US side, we have people that grow up within functions, for example, clinical operations, who spend their entire career, 20 plus years working in development operations. You kind of position them adjacent to somebody in Japan who might only have a year or 6 months experience in the same function. And it does create a bit of a vacuum in terms of information. Now, is that an issue? I would argue no, but it's something that you have to be acutely aware of in terms of how you roll out global initiatives, including technology partners. Absolutely. The why is very important for Japanese culture and explaining some of these nuances. So, Anko, we've talked a lot in the past about things like protocol design and why is it important that we design operationally feasible protocols. Critical because we know if it's infeasible, protocol amendments cost upwards of 500,000 in just operational expense alone. So I would say that one of the learnings I've had is that this isn't about force fitting any one process or any one culture. This is about adopting the cultural nuances across global organizations such that you can harness the power of what it means to have well-versed, operationally diversified employees on the Japanese side with more functionally detailed and functionally specific resources on the US side in order to make rollouts really work effectively.
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot in the prep meeting about the rotational program. I have not personally experienced, but how did that impact your work, our work, which is clinical outsourcing, which is so very detailed and specific, for which we all know there is no training program. You kind of grow into it, almost you land by accident, and then there are no standards. And it's very, very hard to teach someone how to do outsourcing. Um, and if you pass on that expertise and then the person rotates, then you start all over again. How was your experience from that perspective? Brenda, how did it work for you?
Yeah, so thank you. Actually, it's been the most challenging, but the most rewarding for me. So when I first got to my current company, I gracefully inherited a lot of employees from Japan, but did not have the clinical business operations background. And I'm sure that when I walked into that office in the first time and taught the financial reports from the CRO, all of this data and all of this technology that I wanted to put, I'm sure everyone was looking at me like I was insane. I'm sure, but I mean, I put in so much effort and work and the right team members to help that team to come along that journey. And I'm very proud to say that, especially with the kaizen and the diligence that they put into their craft, that is one of the best teams I've ever had under me. They have perfected almost everything that we've taught them in a year. So again, that rotation that happened was a huge advantage for us. At the beginning, we saw it as an adversity that we couldn't overcome. We didn't know how to accomplish the goals that we had in terms of getting our financial management in order for all of our CROs and for all of our vendors. But that team really like made it every effort. The same way I would get up early, they would be up at night, and we worked together virtually and in person. And I'm very proud of that team. And for me, it's one of the best accomplishments I've had in my career, because I could see it. I could see that craft that they've now perfected, and are still in the journey of perfecting it. And so for me, it is very great to see that how we could transform that into something so great. And I think the organization is learning from that it is possible to utilize that model. Now, I think we just need to be prepared when that transition happens. We need to be a little bit more prepared. So when that rotation happens, we're prepared to have the same training program kind of be supported accordingly. But it is a big change, and it is a big challenge at the beginning. But I would say to anyone taking on that challenge that trust and time and really effort will completely pay back in returns that you wouldn't imagine. So for me, it's been very rewarding.
Thank you, Brenda. And I know, Ratan, you said something similar when people you trained and moved into clean ops, and then you found them in a different role, but they understood much better what you did, if I understood correctly from the prep discussion.
Yes, so in the beginning, and especially if you look at the expertise for what we do, in terms of like category management or strategic sourcing, these are the expertise. Normally you don't get in school. You kind of work either big pharma or consulting company, places like that you get. And if you look at how Japanese colleagues are, they stay at the company for longer period of time and get expertise in different areas. So in the beginning when I came, yes, because we would kind of work with whoever the head of clinical outsourcing at in Japan was, and to some extent, train them in category management sourcing because they were not getting that directly in Japan. And 3 years time from they would be head of project management. In the beginning, it was a little bit odd. I have to do this all over again. But the whole idea is that was so good for our company because and so good for procurement and outsourcing because now some of the functional heads understand what we do. So I don't have to go and sell the project management, hey, this is how we can benefit them. They can really see us as a resource to help them in their today to the job. I didn't have to sell them. So to me, there is pros and cons to that rotational plan, and especially how Japanese companies operate. I do think it is more pros because when leaders comes up through the rank, goes through different functions, and after like decades and decades of experience, they are a really good leader for the company because they have been through different business unit, different functions. So I do see in a long term, it's really beneficial to have that well-rounded leadership development a Japanese company traditionally do.
Excellent. And Jen, you had similar experience with the rotational program?
Absolutely. It's a commonplace amongst all Japanese pharma, and I've only had success with it. I think that essentially you find really creative solutions to problems because you're synthesizing information from various points of view. So I think that, anytime you're going to have turnover, that's going to be a challenge, but building playbooks so that you have that written instruction for any type of new folks will be helpful. And I really have enjoyed the that why piece of having new folks come in and challenge how we're doing things from coming from the different perspective, whether it's coming from finance or we've seen a lot of people come from the lab, frankly. So the lab or even from clinical ops, and it's been really, really successful.
Okay, excellent. So I'll end the observation piece with my own observations, and then we'll move to the second part. Japanese companies have been great customers of Clinical Maestro, and some of the longest terms we had as a young company were with Japanese companies. What I found as a general observation is the desire to customize intensely, and take the current process and see if the system can replicate it. And I think this has to do with the very nature of thinking of preservation. It may have to do a lot with the culture, with maybe conserving the status quo because somehow it's working. But that leads to a lot of complexity. In general, especially in pharma company, any kind of technology, any kind of system, and now with the perspective of AI, it's not meant to replicate the status quo. It's meant to to bring efficiencies, to streamline the processes, to bring speed. And that's why, going back to your point, Brenda, understanding the future vision when you are starting the implementation journey, it's so important. Because if the future vision is clearly defined, as you said, Brian, maybe compliance or maybe cost savings. If you know what you are looking for, then you can go and evaluate the current state and then find a path there, which most likely it's not a replica of the current state. It's something different. And that does require change. And to introduce a change, it requires working extremely close with a technology partner. And that also requires building trust to bring the point. But none of these comes natural and easy. And oftentimes a consulting company actually could make a difference there if they had already gained the trust versus, let's say, the technology provider that may be new, or the area that the system gets implemented. In the case of Clinical Maestro, it deconstructs the Excel spreadsheets that people are so used to. That's not easy to do. It's not an easy undertaking. At the same time, once you go through the journey, it tends to be a long journey and a sustainable one.
And Anka,
So, yeah, I wanted to go to you because we've been talking a bit about this too.
yeah,
Brian,
no,
go
Anka,
ahead.
and I think you brought this up. You asked the question about language barriers, and I think what's extremely important, Brenda kind of alluded to this as well, is that when you think about global rollouts and programs and technology, it's extremely important to have advocates across the entire enterprise. Part of that is obviously US centric, part of that is Japanese centric. But one of the things we found extremely successful is to have sponsorship on the Japanese side as well, if something is coming out of the US, as well as sponsorship
Yep.
on the US side. That partnership is absolutely critical. No question that language barrier is somewhat of a challenge, right? In many cases, you find executives of Japanese companies that are quite fluent. One or two levels down below that, you typically find a lot of working Japanese, but very, very little English that's spoken in the workplace. And so, in that respect, it's critically important that with technology or with initiatives, that there's a partnership model. And as you know, Japanese culture tends to be a bit more top down than kind of socialized or bottoms up in American culture or Western European. And so as a result, we do get a lot of compliance, but it is critical that you have that endorsement at the very highest of levels. absent of that, we've seen a lot of programs really struggle to kind of launch, but more importantly, struggle to be successful in the long term. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think we talked about it a little bit, but I just want to be very explicit on that point. By the way, that could be in the form of internal partnerships. As you mentioned, consultants. We have a Japanese team that we typically bring in to a lot of our Japanese initiatives to make sure that we have local currency and local fluency. But critically important as teams think about, especially with Clinical Maestro, being successful with the technology implementation.
That's very true. That's very true, and it's actually very interesting in general. With the general question that I wanted to ask you, when it comes to any kind of technology solution, would you say the decision is through a collaborative process, U.S. Japanese teams, or is it more in Japan? And I'm talking about any kind of technology solution. It could be patient recruitment with AI, or the next company CTMS, or the resource management software, whatever they may be. Where would you say the decision is, and how, who decides when it comes to study level or maybe corporate level? Corporate level, I think I know, but more study level, I would say.
I think the answer is it depends. What I would say is that you have a range of Japanese biopharma companies where some would say, hey, US has a ton of autonomy and control over the direction of work, including at the study level, making decisions. Others, would tell you privately, hey, we're just basically a US affiliate. And, we have very, very little control over what happens. We can make suggestions, but decisions are really held within the Japan side of the business. So I think there's a range, Anka, to be honest. And I would argue what is right for one company is not always right for all companies. In many cases, what is right for Japanese companies is not only right for the enterprise, but right for the culture. And so I think it's important to consider that. So as an example, I would say more common than not, smaller to mid-sized Japanese biopharma companies are very culturally Japanese. And as a result, if I were to present on the American side something that I think is critically important for the business, I would bring the leadership along, and I would accept the fact that it's likely going to take some time in order to galvanize that support. I think sometimes Americans tend to be a little bit more culturally fast-paced, and so they mistake the speed with a lack of appetite for change. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just culturally Japan has a lot more contemplation. As we talked about the word Kaizen, they want to make sure that anything they pursue, they get right. And so as a result, I think patience is really important as American leaders think about interfacing with Japan culturally, but also making sure that they can be successful in pursuing initiatives they think is critical for the enterprise.
I want to add
Great point and
to
great
that, Brian,
leeway
because
to the success.
I think part of why it's been successful for me is listening a little bit more than we usually typically do. And then the America side is really listening to what is important at every level. And then the journey has to be backed up with some level of consistency and value. So I think once you take that approach, I think the trust starts building. And I think that is where they, especially in this senior level, might listen. Okay, let me hear, and what is the value that this is bringing to it, and how does that tie to my 20-year plan? So, like, yes, they're out in 20 years, and we're not, but tie that message every time and have some proof in the value. I think the consensus will come, but you do have to be patient.
Excellent.
Um,
And what would you say was your best success story, Brenda, since we are going around about successes?
I think my budget team is my one success, like, especially now, like I just sat through a couple of meetings while I was in Japan where I got to see them really explained on their side. I actually listened in Japanese and got to see them explain everything they've learned and how to implement it. And I got to see them really use that value on how to improve, a very core basic concept to our finance team. And it was an amazing experience for me to see that. So for me, it was really rewarding to kind of see them really learn, and not only learn, but now take it to the next level, and really, advise and consult on things that they've learned. So that is definitely amazing.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Ratan, what would you say define your success journeys with Japanese companies? You certainly have been for a very long time with the same organization. Something is keeping you here.
Uh, One thing which I know how Brian said it about the new technology implementation. One thing which has really worked for my team here in US has been is that you implement on a study or multiple studies something, show the ROI. And when you're talking about ROI, it's definitely not just the financial. What flies it, like, hey, earlier it used to take us 8 weeks, now it takes us 3 weeks, those type of things. And then you kind of, because our Japanese colleagues are engaged even in the US study, say at the PM level. So kind of they are the one who would go ahead and talk, this worked here, this didn't work here. And this is mainly from my Otsuka days, because we implemented a lot of new technology here in US, whether it was say clinical ink or e-consent, all those pieces. And after we made it successful here on one study and multiple study, all those idea kind of went to Japan, and they tried say clinical ink and e-source. They tried those, e-consent. So I think success breeds success, and to me that is the biggest piece. That sometimes we are more deliberative in terms of how decisions are made, and you do a pilot, make it successful, then implement it further, and it's across the board, just not technology, but technology. As we are having this discussion.
So it goes to the baby steps that didn't get a lot of ranking from our viewers, but my experience is exactly the same, Ratan. Is baby steps work well, but in the baby step, try not to define it as a giant step. So that is calibrating what success looks like in the pilot or in the following stage or in the following stage, and measuring it, going back to the ROI discussion, very important. And then going global, or then expanding enterprise. But this resonates very, very much to me personally in my journey, both when I was doing outsourcing and now as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
What would you say, Jen, with your perspective? We talked about agility a lot, and I know you've been going through some changes, and actually the entire industry is going through major transformation again and again, right? It's changing outsourcing model, changing landscape, and plus the financial pressures that we are all seeing, and the macroeconomic environment. Um, what were some of the successful stories on your end?
Well, I think it lends to that whole concept, as Brian mentioned, of Kaizen, of continuous improvement, and why having fundamentally a culture that would be rotating, you could never get too comfortable with anything because the expectation is for you to grow and is for you to improve. And so with that, to be successful is really to be adaptable. And one thing that our company recently pivoted to is, the concept of implementing agile into the way in which we execute on projects. So with that, having smaller teams that maybe the vocabulary is just a little bit different from saying cross-functional team, but having that whole methodology built into the company infrastructure allowed us to really pivot really quickly recently to implement some pretty massive tech tech solutions. But I really think that it is because it started at the corporate level of saying that this is what we're going to do. The buy-in was at the top, so everybody knew that we had support. And then the actual execution, we did it in a different way than we normally had. We broke the mold by saying, you can break the mold because it's under the guise of agile, and that's really helped us be different in this last go around, I would say.
Jen, you gave a great presentation at Scope. We were actually on the same track. It was about evaluating AI and creating a framework for risk evaluation. And wanted to ask you, going back on this, what do you think it's going to be the adoption of technologies that do incorporate AI, and not necessarily drug discovery, not necessarily high impact type solutions that impact the outcome of the trial? Would you think that Japanese companies or maybe your organization would be more or less inclined to adopt?
On the surface, I would say less, but then in reality, I've been a part of several different working groups that are solutioning and putting forth use cases for AI specifically in clinical development, and all of that is coming from Japan. So all of our technical leadership and our thought leadership is coming out of Japan. So structurally, I wouldn't guess that we would be leaders in this area, but in fact, this is an area that Astellas is actually very comfortable with in terms of an idea and now execution through a myriad of a process. This is the part where I wanted to speak at the conference, what I've learned, and different ways that may apply to other companies of how do you get your requirements and checklists and all the different areas that you're going to need to vet and view a solution differently to ensure that you are mitigating the risk of using different LLMs, and where does this data come from? Has it been trained on data that they don't own, et cetera, et cetera? How do you maintain privacy for any kind of data that of yours that may be exposed to a supplier solution? And even knowing to even ask all of your current suppliers and have a refresh. Don't even wait to start a new contract with someone. A refresh of due diligence, because some of these suppliers may be proactively implementing different facets of this new technology for a current solution that you didn't envision when you actually put your contract together. So you might need to make sure you have your, privacy, your hosted service terms, etc. So, I mean, I'm pretty passionate about this area because I think I want to reduce barriers to adoption. And so having a well-organized approach that we can go to the business, we can go to our digital team, we can go to our legal team, and then we can more quickly iterate through all of these questions. I think that we'll more likely to have success in implementing a new technology.
That's a great perspective, because I'm also seeing a lot of interest coming from Japanese companies, which I thought would be the opposite in terms of implementing AI. And you are making a great point. We are an example in which our MSA has no language on AI because we didn't use it at the time. We are using it now. So even as a supplier, it's an interesting angle. But this goes, and I brought in AI because I wanted to go to you, Brian, next. The more you use AI, the more you kind of tend to customize less. And this industry, our industry, I think, needs to be more streamlined. It's particularly the area we are running, which is outsourcing and CRO engagement. So that word simplification, and with the usage of AI, you can only use AI when there is good data structure. But if the data is in Excel and unstandardized, how will you ever gain the power of this great technology? So it has to come through some simplification, some standardization, data structure, and then, of course, it drives analytics and learning. So coming from the consulting perspective, Brian, we talked a little bit about your perspective on what success, some of the success stories that you have experienced working with
Yeah,
Japanese pharma.
yeah, on AI, I guess I'd maybe speak to that first. I think we are absolutely in the infancy of AI. I like to joke around with people that pharma is still on Windows XP, but in some respects, there's truth to that, right? I mean, novel technology is far ahead of pharma in terms of use of technology. Amazon has been predicting when all of us need to reorder toilet paper or need toothpaste, but we still haven't applied much of that logic to drug development. And so we've done a lot of work around analytics for things like Anka, as you cited, site monitoring. So where do we spend time? Which site is performing better than others? Years ago, we did some work related to the movie Moneyball, if you guys are familiar with that, which was that there are a lot of disparate data sources that aggregated together actually can tell the outcome of American baseball games. Well, that logic has been applied in high tech, and it should be applied in drug development as well. So I think in that respect, we're seeing a huge amount of investment in AI, no question. I think pharma generally is relatively antiquated when it comes to these adoption of these types of technologies. But I think to your point, when it comes to systems configuration, which all of us know, everybody wants to configure systems exactly to their specifications, only to find out that within a year after you finish the SI work, you have to redo a refresher and update, and it requires quite a bit more work. So I think the speed and the pace at which technology is designed and implemented is going to accelerate. I think we're starting to see that there's a balance between customization and time to implement. And I do think that there's a lot of people like to talk about AI when it comes to Google and AlphaFold and research. And I think no question when quantum computing comes along, coupled with AI, we are going to have new modalities of drugs that the human mind was never able to contemplate. But before then, there's a lot of operational outcomes that we can do that can achieve bottom line success to help us to repurpose the advancement of other drugs. So I don't know if that context provides a little bit of help, but I think that pharma is starting to come along for that. And we're starting to see some of the shifting dynamics with sourcing models as a result. Pharma wants a lot more control over strategic decision making so that they can better optimize their pipelines and not be so reliant necessarily on source vendors in order to help them make strategic decisions.
And what would you say in this context was maybe a success story with a Japanese client, if there was any? But I'm sure there are plenty actually.
I will say that there was a company we worked with embedding a new CTMS system. They were looking to move to a more unified vendor with a number of their technologies, and through a series of discussions, I would say more of a forcing function than a strategic decision. But they opted for mostly an out-of-box design configuration, and within 9 months' time, which is pretty much about as fast as I've seen within the industry, they were able to embed a new CTMS within their organization, critical for their launch. So I would say, my learning to that, and even myself as a consultant, I had some trepidation around that pace and that speed, more so to get everybody on board with the systems configuration. But ultimately, it's back to that 80-20 rule. Do you spend 80% of your time on configuring 20% that really goes unused? And I think that success is a testament to that company's ability to pursue that narrative and then also deliver on that vision.
Absolutely. So we have 6 minutes left, and I want to go back to our host, Brenda, and to everyone actually going a final round of thoughts here. Great thought leadership. I would say um, the experts like you, especially in a niche domain like ours, which is the what I call the business side of running trials, the financial aspects, the CRO negotiations, the vendor management, the governance, the things that are so critical to a trial, but somehow are in the background and far less talked about. We don't get to meet often, and we don't get to speak or share experiences often. So for me, this is an honor and a pleasure to have you all here today sharing thoughts. So I want to go back to the host, Brenda, with some final thoughts. You've heard the observations. You heard some of the success stories. You kept nodding. what would you say, what would be kind of the learning that you want to pass on to your team? And by the way, many of your team members are on the call, I know, and signed up for the webinar.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's one of the greatest things we could take away is that there is opportunity, right? And for those of us that have been in the industry and know how to do business operations and implement things, I think it's a great reward to share that with a Japanese company that's growing, that's a global wants to be a global organization and contribute to our patients. So the patient that you could have and share your knowledge and make sure that you understand that vision and tie everything together and bring that organization into the future, especially with things like AI. I just came from, for example, Fabcom this year, and the things that people are doing with AI is amazing. But I look at it and I challenge myself of like, how do I share this value? How do I connect that to? And today I learned a couple of other things that, and I hope that everyone attending today could take some nuggets away, and really base it on trust. Understand that the culture brings a lot of value, especially if you're in a Japanese setting, because it does force you to really think about the return on investment and use that to your advantage to really implement efficiencies within that organization. And ultimately, all we want is to bring novel therapies to our patients. So take all of that and take some of the nuggets that you learned today and take them forward within those organizations, because you will create value with it. So thank you for the opportunity, Anka,
Yeah,
today for sure.
yeah.
And all the
Thank you so
panelists.
much, Brenda. Thank you so much, Brenda. Any final thoughts from you, Ratan, Jen, Brian, before we end?
Thanks for having me, Anka. It was like, really good experience. And I would say to the people listening, we have a lot more opportunities. People say that pharma company moves slow, and I'm certain there is some study going which is still on paper, but we have to keep pushing the boundaries. We have to keep pushing the boundaries to bring drugs faster to the patient because there are so much more needs. So with that,
Thank you. And that's actually what drives us all ultimately, to do more in our jobs. Jen, a final thought from you?
Thank you so much, Anka. Thank you so much to the panelists to share this time today, to discuss these important issues. Completely echo the sentiments of my colleagues. The patients are waiting, and it's our job basically to do everything we can to support them.
Excellent. And Brian, final thought from you?
No, I just wanted to thank the panelists. This has been a great conversation, in the prep as well as this discussion. I would offer, if there's any questions offline, of course, feel free to reach out to Anka. Would be happy to discuss and kind of put our collective heads together. But I think these are important topics, infrequently talked about, Anka. So I appreciate you bringing this forum together, especially with this very experienced panel of professionals. Because these are challenges that, in global, business and pharma companies that we operate in are really important that we get right, and really are material for some of the outcomes that companies are looking to achieve. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much. And in that spirit, we will host another great webinar on AI in May. The date is not, it's not yet set, sometimes in the middle of the month. And we are going to do something wild. Hopefully it works. We are going to actually have the AI interact live, reading some proposals, doing some due diligence, doing some scoring. And so far it has done well under pressure questions, let's say, but we are actually going to try to do a live session sometimes in May. So I'll be sure to share that. Thank you again for joining today to this almost quote unquote, I'd like to call it lunch and learn, if we could only be on the same time zone and figure out what lunchtime is. But given it's almost dinner time in the US, thank you so much for joining, and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank
Thank
you.
thank you
you
guys.
all.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.